A passion of mine for a long time to actually do the research and to share that information with people all through Maine and throughout the country and throughout the US and throughout the world, actually. So I've done a lot of compost work internationally, so I'm going to share some of that with you today, and hopefully you will enjoy the presentation. As we go along, if you have questions, I think we're going to use the chat box today to enter the questions, and maybe at the end, if there's not 200 people or so, we can open up for some verbal conversation as well. So today what I'm going to talk about is through those 20 years, I've learned that people love their compost. If you're a gardener in this day and age, compost is one of the things that comes up in the top of your mind this time of year and in the fall, and people love their compost. But the other thing I found is people also abuse compost. So there's this love-hate relationship with compost in gardening. So as we move through this, we're going to talk about how to use compost and how not to abuse it through time. So if I can make this thing work. So one of the things that I share with people is that compost has a lot of variability. There is no such thing as your typical compost. It is all over the board. And in 2017, I went to the University of Maine that has a analytical lab. Most of you, hopefully some of you do your soil testing there, but we can also do compost testing there. And we had 122 samples go through that lab in 1 year. And you can see the range of the different characteristics of the compost. So some of the ones that I want you to look at, particularly that you may be familiar with, is pH. Look at the pH, it's 2.3 to 8.7. So when you look at your compost and you get it out of a bag, there's no way you know whether you're getting something that has a pH that's very acidic or something that is actually alkaline. It's could be all over the board. The other one that people are often curious about is the TN, which stands for total percent nitrogen. So again, you go from practically nothing to almost 4%. So again, compost is going to be all over the board as far as what is actually in there for nutrients as well. And you can see the same thing is true for the potassium and phosphorus levels as well. They're just all over the board, and they're very variable. So the question becomes, what causes the variation in those compost samples? And a lot of times it's where it comes from. So if you're getting it from a farm, which is the picture on the left, this is a farm in Clinton, Maine that produces a lot of compost. They're a large dairy farm. They milk 850 head of cows, and they have lots of manure and lots of other bedding materials. So that compost is very rich in nitrogen. It's very much a farm-based compost, is what we call it. The picture on the right is in Millinocket, Maine. It's a municipality. So this is what is being collected from yards and leaves, and people bring in maybe some food scraps, but it's much more a carbon-based or a homeowner municipal type compost. These are two hugely different types of compost. And people, a lot of times, will just group these together as one and not really understand the difference between them. Another thing that makes a difference is actually the process. How does the composter actually process the feedstocks that they're actually using? So we'll start on the lower left in the town of China. That's where I am currently, and that's my hometown. We basically have a bin at the transfer station where we collect food waste. We can put horse bedding in there, we can put leaves in there, but they basically collect this, they put it in this bin. Once that bin is full, they take a front end loader, they basically stockpile out back and call it close enough, and then they start having people take it in the spring or late fall, or actually you can take it anytime you want. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's finished compost, it's just that it's broken down food and broken down bedding or whatever it may be there. So there's a lot of variability in that particular compost. The picture at noon in the center, this is at the University of Maine, we have what's called an in-vessel tunnel system, where we actually process all of our pre-consumer food waste coming out of our food centers. And we also use horse bedding from the University Equine Center. So it's all the material that goes into this system comes from the university, and the end product actually goes back into the landscaping at the university. So it's a kind of a neat closed loop system. But this system becomes very consistent. It has an auger system that actually processes the food. The recipe that goes in is very consistent, and the process going through it is very consistent. So it starts at one end of the 40-foot tunnel and exits about 18 to 21 days on the far end of the tunnel. And all the food scraps, you can identify any of the food scraps or any of the materials that was originally placed in it. The picture in the lower right, this is it's called a scarab turner. This is a big turner. These are 10 feet tall piles. This is down in Auburn, Lewiston, Maine at We Compost MP Bark. But this is basically what was originally in that pile was leaves and food waste. So they collect food waste from the greater Portland area. They bring it up to the site in Auburn. They compost it with leaves that are collected in the fall, and you end up with this really nice product. But it's a different product even than what you see at the university because of the way it's been aerated and turned. The other thing that makes a big difference is the time in which it's going to be composted. So the longer it's composted, the more mature that compost is, which means that the more stable it is. It's more like humus at that point in time rather than acting as a nutrient. So if you're buying it bagged, which is where we see a lot of product being sold this time of year is bagged product, this should be very, very mature type of compost. It's something that's taken a long time to go through the process, somewhere between 6 to 9 months before it's actually bagged. And it's very stable. It shouldn't be hot. When you grab a bag of finished compost off the shelf, it should not be hot. It shouldn't even be warm. It should have holes in the bag because there's still biological activity in it, but it shouldn't be warm. If you buy it bulk, which you can do from many different sources in Maine, this tends to be a little bit more immature. It may have a little steam coming off from it. So this is material that is going to be used differently than the bag material, and it's going to have a different nutrient content, and it's going to have a different pH content actually as well. So the process matters as far as how the variability or what causes the variability in the compost. But the real question is, how is the compost going to be used? And this is really where that variability comes into play and is really important. Are you going to use it in container mixes, or are you going to use it in high tunnels in some type of hoop structure, or are you just going to field apply it or apply it into your gardens? So the manner in which you use this compost is really, really important to understanding the type of compost that you should buy, or the maturity and the process in which that compost was actually made. This is actually a picture of compost being applied in Western Pennsylvania onto some wheat stubble, and they were going to plant soybeans into it the following year. So if you're going to use it in seedling, to start seedlings or to potted plants, you need to be extremely careful about how it's actually used and what types of materials it is, and not only the type but also the amount. So this is a tray that one of my graduate students started several years ago, and you can the tags on the left-hand side kind of give you a clue as to what it is. So the C10 that you see there, that means it's 100% compost. So it's nothing but compost. The next one up is C2. That one's 20% compost. The next one's C3, 30. KR is a private blend. So we were asked to do this, develop a potting mix for a composter. So this is the compost mix that they had. I'm sorry, the one before the C5. So it's a 50% mix. The one after the KR is a 30%, and then there's also a 10% mix in there. So if you look at this, they're all seeded the same thing. These are all head lettuce seedlings that were planted. And you can see that 100%, the germination rate, I can bring up the rates, I think. Oh, sorry. The germination rates, between at the 100, it was 0. So there was something going on with the compost that prevented the seedlings from germinating. Even at the 50% rate, you can see that the germination rate and the seedling development was really pretty poor, as with a private blend. But when you got into 20 and 30%, and actually if you go beyond that to the 10%, you can actually start to see that the compost, the blended part of that did pretty well. So what that tells us is that when you're using compost, 100% compost is not what you want to be using. Even at 50% composting is not what you want to be, but you want to be somewhere between that 10 to 30% by volume mixture to use in the seedlings. So more is not necessarily better. The other thing that we see a lot of is it's used in container mixes or raised bed productions. So the picture that you see on the left, the lower left, is actually in Jamaica. This is lettuce, and they use those shelters over the lettuce, not like we use them here in Maine to create heat, but they use them to prevent the shredding of the lettuce because of heavy rainstorms. So it's a rain shelter more than anything else. And there's also the gallon buckets are also lettuce, and then the lower right are coconut bags, coconut husk bags with some compost in it that also are producing lettuce. But all these only have about 20% by volume compost mixed into them. And that's because it's really great for holding water moisture. It is really good for root porosity or root bulk density to allow the roots to actually penetrate through it. But if you get too much, you get this negative effect on the production of the lettuce, and you get a negative effect on the roots. And a lot of that has to do with this, that compost is biologically very active, and it takes a lot of oxygen out of the soil that is actually required by the plant. So there can be an oxygen deprivation by using too much compost that is particularly immature. So we use it in cropping systems as well. So on the upper left, this is a permanent or semi-permanent cropping system where we're using plasticulture to grow strawberries. This is up in Farmington, Maine. The lower left is we're just making some raised beds at our research site at Highmore to plant some crops. And then you've got the pepper plants, again in Jamaica, that are basically they grow continuously for over 2 years. Peppers down there, they won't replant that house for almost 2 years before they take it out and do it again. But in the cropping systems, in both the pepper house and in the strawberries, you don't have an opportunity to add more compost once those systems are developed. So if you're thinking about how much compost to actually add into those systems, you want to be on that high side because it's a long-term investment into that system. So you're looking at adding, that 30 to 40% by volume at that point in time. These are hardy transplants that are going into the system so they can withstand a little bit more compost. But it's that long-term impact that you want to have because you don't have an opportunity to add additional compost into those systems. Unlike the lower system on the left, where this is an annual system, we can reduce the amount and we can add compost into that system every year when we're developing those beds. So thinking about how you're actually growing and what the system is will also determine the amount of compost to be used. So how does compost affect the soil, and how does it actually work? Most people think about compost as, oh, I'm going to add a whole bunch of nutrients to the cropping system and to my plants, and plants are going to be happy because they're getting all these nutrients. And that is probably the furthest from the truth. You shouldn't think of compost as a nutrient source. It is not a fertilizer to be used as such. So there are three, and we'll talk about why that is, but there are three basic components to your soil. So there's the soil structure, the chemistry, and the biology. And most people, when they're growing and thinking about things, think about only the chemistry, which is the nutrient part of it. But compost, even though it does have nutrients in it, it really is the structural and the biological component that are the big factors that make the difference. So here's a little bit more detail into that. So as you know, soil has biology. It's a living system. There are all kinds of things in that soil. You pick up a teaspoon of soil and there's hundreds of millions of different types of living organisms in it, from fungi to bacteria to actinomycetes to all kinds of different things that we can't see, but it's really important. So what that compost is doing, it's actually feeding that microbial population that we can't see. It's feeding all those little organisms that are really beneficial for us growing our plants that we eventually want. But it's those organisms in the soil that really are doing the work, providing the nutrients to the plants, because they're the ones releasing the nutrients from organic material that make those nutrients what we call plant available. I put a question mark by, does it increase microbial diversity? And I get this question quite often that says, I want a compost that is high in fungus because I want to increase my soil fungus, or I want to increase my, bacteria of this particular type of bacteria. The reality is that the amount of compost that you add and the amount of organisms that are in that compost are going to be insignificant to really the amount of organisms that are already present in your native soil. So even though you may be adding some different microbes into the soil, the native soil populations or microbes are going to quickly outnumber and outcompete any added diversity that you put into it. So you can try, but I have not seen research or data that actually supports that we're actually increasing the microbial diversity in soils. We are certainly increasing the microbial population by feeding it, though. Mycorrhizal fungi is one of them, that we often talk about. That's a real beneficial root fungus that increases the plant efficiency by increasing water and increasing phosphorus uptake. But also increases resistance to soil-borne pathogens. So anytime that you can increase this mycorrhizal fungi, which is a beneficial fungus, symbiotically with your plants, it's really a good thing. And compost has been shown to really increase these mycorrhizal fungi in the soils. So that's one way in which compost really helps biologically to improve your soil's biological system. Soil structure is the way in which all those little soil aggregates are put together. So we know that soil is basically sand, silts, and clays, and the way in which they're actually constructed together forms what we call soil structure, along with the organic matter. So we have to have a whole bunch of what we call glues or aggregates to kind of bond these particles together. And what this does, it allows you to form macropores and micropores where water can be held, nutrients can be held on the surface. It allows for root penetration. It allows for water when it rains to actually infiltrate rather than run off. There's just so much stuff that the soil structure does. And by adding organic matter, you're again improving, you're providing those glues and those organic materials that the microorganisms are using to produce these hyphae and these different mechanisms to actually attach the soil particles together to form these aggregates. So you really can, sorry, not sure what happened. So you can really improve your soil structure by adding compost into the mix. So this is what it does. It actually, these are your soil particles, and what you want is you want a whole bunch of air spaces, and you want this water porosity to be able to move in, and it's all these hyphae. Because we know that if we start to collapse these spaces and we start to bring these black particles in really tight and the pore spaces get really small, this is when we get soil compaction, and roots can't penetrate it, water doesn't go through it, and roots can't penetrate it. It just gets to be a real mess. And we do this by actually rototilling, by walking, by running equipment over soils, particularly when the soils are wet. We break down the soil structure. So the third component in soils is the soil chemistry, right? And this is the one that people often want to talk about and focus on the most. So it's the idea that compost does not have a lot of nutrients there. But what it does, it increases the soil's ability to hold nutrients in place. So if the soil has a lot of phosphorus or potassium or calcium, magnesium, some of the other plant nutrients, it needs to be held somehow and become available to the plant. And most of those components are held on by organic matter. So it's this ability to hold nutrients in place that's really a key component in the chemistry of adding compost to your gardens. It also increases what we call buffering capacity. So this is dealing with how fast pH rises and falls. And we know that pH wants to be somewhere around between 6 and 6.8 for most gardens. And if we can make that remain stable over a long period of time, that means we have to add less things like lime or sulfur if we change it depending on the direction. So how does it actually work? We know that plant nutrients are either a cation or an anion. They're either positively or negatively charged. So I listed 5 major plant nutrients: nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium. 3 of those, as a rule, in which the plant takes up are cations. They are potassium, the calcium, and magnesium. These are positively charged ions that are available to the plant. The phosphorus and nitrogen are dependent on the form in which they're in. Phosphorus, as a rule, is P2O5, which is an anion. It's a negatively charged, so it doesn't directly hold onto the soil surface. And the nitrogen depends on the form. It could be NH03, it could be NH4. There's just a variety of different ones. So nitrogen is one that we often don't talk about, but as far as bonding goes. So here's how it works. Soil particles are negatively charged. Most of your plant cations are positively charged. And same with organic matter or compost. Compost is negatively charged. So the more negative sites that you can see, and you can see the signs here, the more negative sites you have, the more positive cations can be attached. And those are the magnesium, calcium, and potassium, and sometimes nitrogen. So if we had only 2 negative sites on this slide, then we only have 2 cations or ions that are available to a plant. But we have 12 or a dozen or 12 or 15, I'm not sure how many are on there, but if we had 100 on there, that soil particle or organic matter particle would actually be able to hold 100 different plant nutrients onto it. So it's not that the compost is adding all these different plant nutrients, it's adding all these negative sites so that the plant nutrients can actually stay attached. And it's called the cation exchange capacity, CEC. So if you do a soil test, and hopefully you've all done soil tests in your gardens at some point in time, and this is a number that oftentimes is overlooked, it's called CEC. If you look at that, and you look at the amount of organic matter that you have, those 2 numbers are correlated. The higher the organic matter, the higher the CEC, to a point. And the CEC, if you're up around 10 to 12, that's really good. That's really what you want to be. But if you're up in the 20 to 30 range, which I've seen, you're probably a little bit too aggressive with your organic matter. So cation exchange capacity on sand, if you just had a sandy soil, it's in milliequivalency, so it's 0 to 8. So it's not holding a lot of nutrients. So if you have sand, it doesn't hold water, it doesn't hold nutrients, it drains real well, so you get it in the spring, but it has a lot of negative things to it. On the other scale, if you have clay, you actually hold a fair number of nutrients. It holds water sometimes too well, okay? But it still doesn't hold near the amount of nutrients that organic matter or compost holds. Organic matter compost is going to be 3 to 10 times more holding capacity for those nutrients than any other type of soil particle. So adding compost to your garden really increases the soil's ability to hold plant nutrients. But again, I want to emphasize you can also abuse that because you don't want to add too much, because if you over apply, you can have negative results as well. So here's some work, research that I did down in Lewiston, and this is at a fairly large commercial vegetable farm in Lewiston, the Belanger farm, Rick Belanger's farm. And you can see way up here at the top, if you can follow my pointer, you see the color change. It's dark green to the top of the slide, and the color turns almost a light green, pale green, coming towards us on the lower part of the slide. You can see my blue flags on the right. You can see a little bit of the compost applied here. So this is a compost application rate trial to determine, how much compost should I actually be adding in to grow. These are green beans, string beans. Well, Rick called me up one day and said, "Mark, you got to come down and look at this crop." He said, "It's gonna fail." He says, you told me that compost would actually grow some good string beans, and they look like," I won't use the words he used, but he wasn't real happy with me. Let's put it that way. So, at this point in time here, this is where he was driving a tractor and he actually turned off his commercial fertilizer. Okay, so these did not get any pre-plant fertilizer. So I went down and I said, "Oh no." I said, "Let's be patient for a couple of weeks and see what happens." I said, "I've got money to pay for the crop. If you lose, you're not going to lose money, because I'll pay you for it if I need to out of the funding project. And, let's just be patient and see what happens." So this is the same spot 2 weeks later. You can just barely see where the fertilizer shut off, but look how green those plants are. It just takes longer for that compost to react and provide those nutrients to the crop over time. So don't panic when you get, when you add compost and it doesn't look like the crop's responding. Just give it a little bit of time. It needs to have warm soils. It needs to have appropriate moisture, because this is all happening because of the biological activity in the soil. Conventional fertilizers, when you add it, is happening because of chemistry. When you add compost, it's happening because of biology. And in order for biology to work, it needs to happen under very specific conditions. So we eventually picked a really nice crop. He was really happy. The nice thing is, the next year we didn't apply any compost here. And he says, "You got to come down and look at it." I didn't take pictures, but he had sweet corn in here, and where the compost was applied, it was about 1.5 feet taller early on in the season versus to where there was conventional fertilizer added, and it was like night and day. You could just see where we had applied compost the year before. So there's a residual effect of adding compost from year to year. And with that, I did a bench study. This is, a fair number of years ago now, but looking at pots and looking at how long does the compost actually have an effect on the growth. So we're looking at different types of compost, from fish to bean compost. We have a control in there, and this is just regular potting mix. The first crop we grew was actually lettuce. We then came in with annual ryegrass, and we've cut. This is our after the second time we've cut this ryegrass, and these pots just kept producing and producing and producing, and it's because those nutrients were held in place. When we watered the control pot here, the nutrients were just kind of hanging out. They weren't really attached to anything, so they would actually leach out, and we would lose those nutrients, but not in the composting mix. So a lot of people like to use it in raised beds. So this is a project that I did in raised beds looking at composting. These are pepper plants. So if you start in the upper left hand, you have a control, which means there's no compost in there. That's just native soil. You go to the right, it's 10%, 25%, and then 50% coming all the way around. Most people would say, oh, look at the 50% compost. Those plants look great. The problem is at 50%, they didn't produce many peppers. And what happens is with peppers, if you've ever over fertilized peppers, you know that they stay vegetative and they don't actually produce fruit. Peppers like to be a little bit stressed to set fruit. And if they're not stressed, they're not going to set fruit and you're not going to get any peppers. So you can get these big lush green plants that no fruit. And people call me and say, what happened to my pepper plants? You over fertilize them. So actually in this project, this is actually conducted at the Maine State Prison. Some of you may be interested to know that I conduct a lot of programming there, and actually they're interested in doing a fair amount of research there. So we do these small demonstration projects. But the 25% by volume was actually the best producing. They made the best, what we call marketable size, the marketable weights were the best, even though the plants didn't look nearly as good as the 50%, but the 25% by volume was the best. The 10% was actually the next best. So the question becomes, why would you add that additional 25% of compost if it's not going to give you any benefit, if it's actually going to give you a negative? So this is where I oftentimes talk about how people abuse it. They actually add way too much and expect the results to be way too good. This is Dr. Hutton and I, he's our vegetable specialist, have been running a compost trials in high tunnels, looking at tomato yields. This will be our 8th year coming up on this. And so we added by cubic yards this time. So if you look at the graph real quick, you get 10 cubic yards, 20 cubic yards, 50 cubic yards, and 90 cubic yards. But you can see the yield curve, the yield response, which is in the blue line. So as it comes up to 20%, it goes to 50%, you get a little bit of an increase, but then as it goes to 90, you actually start to get a decrease. And this is something that we saw right from year one, that as the more compost we applied up to a certain point was economically beneficial and yield beneficial. But after that point, we started to get a negative response. And we've seen this in sweet corn, we've seen it in pumpkins, we've seen it in cucumbers, we see it in tomatoes, we see it in a lot of crops where you can actually over apply compost and get a negative result. So keep that in mind. Economically, we want to be somewhere around 20 cubic yards per acre. And if you're thinking about it as a home gardener, that would be 6 bags of compost per 1,000 square feet. So if you have a 20 by 50 foot garden, that's 1,000 square feet, you're looking at somewhere around 6 bags that you would buy at a home hardware store or a compost operation. 6 cubic feet is all you're going to add. It's not much. I oftentimes describe it as putting pepper on your mashed potatoes. It's not a black layer. It's just to spice it up a little bit and to give it a little bit of extra zip. This is another project at the Maine State Prison. These are squash plants. This is winter squash. So starting on the left, 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. Rows 1 and 3 had no compost. Rows 2 and 4 had compost in it, and you can see the huge difference of what that did. And this was about the application rate was 6 cubic feet per 1,000 square feet of garden. So it's just amazing how much how a very little amount of compost can actually make a huge difference. And the difference in this one was actually in the water holding capacity. Okay? The 1 and 3 just dried out all the time. We couldn't keep enough water onto them. And by adding that little bit of compost to rows 2 and 4, the little bit of water that we could add actually stayed in place and was really beneficial. So there's you can start doing some calculations as far as compost application rates, and we oftentimes calculate in cubic yards. but for home gardeners, we will do it in cubic feet. You can do it what we call agronomic rates, but that's all good and dandy. And I use this slide for a class that I teach, and I actually am setting up my students for a trick question, because the question becomes, how do you calculate the amount of compost to use in a garden or in a field setting? And normally we'd say, okay, we're going to go through all these calculations, how much phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen is there, how much required for the crop. But for composting, it doesn't matter, because you're not going to meet any of your crop nutrient needs with a compost application. It's going to be a standard application of 6 cubic feet per 1,000 square feet of garden, or somewhere between 10 to 15 cubic yards per acre. And that's because of all the other non-chemical things that you're going to do and the benefits that it has. You can get a compost analysis, and if you're buying compost bulk, I would encourage you to ask the composter that's providing to you for a nutrient analysis. And there are 2 things that I want you to look at quickly, and they're highlighted. One is the bulk density. This is how heavy it weighs. So the bulk density should be somewhere between 800 to 1,200 pounds. This means that it's not too wet and it's not too dry. There's enough moisture there for the microbial activities to still be active in the pile. And it's a reasonable measure to have. The one right below that is conductivity. This is a measure of salt. So a lot of our plants that we grow in our home gardens are salt sensitive. Right? So if this number creeps above 4, right, we're going to start to have some concerns. And I've gotten to the point now where I can look at these compost analysis, and if that number is around 6, 7, 8, I can almost tell them without knowing what the feedstocks are. And most of the time, it's going to be food waste composting. It's going to be food waste coming from institutions, because a lot of our institutional food are high in salts, and those salts are transferred to the compost pile and are not leached out or processed by the microorganisms. So food waste compost tends to have very high conductivity, unlike manure-based or even seaweed-based or fish-based or some type of lobster waste is usually not that high. But that's, tomatoes are particularly sensitive to salts. The other one I want you to look at is way down at the bottom, and they're highlighted in green to the right. So the first one is ammonia. So if this ammonia is even this high in the 58 to anything actually above 10, you are not going to use this in your potting mixes, because the amount of ammonia, even though we can't smell it, that ammonia in the compost is actually going to kill your seedlings and prevent any type of germination. So if it's this high or at this level, and you directly field apply it, or you're planting tomatoes into it, or you're transplanting squash into it in the field where it's actually being diluted in the field, it's not going to be an issue. It's actually going to be okay. It's going to be a benefit for the plant. But if you're using it for a potting mix or transplanting into pots, it's going to be a real issue. So that's a real concern if you're depends on the end use. The bottom one is nitrate. This is the form of nitrogen that the plant actually takes up. So the higher that number is, the more fertility you're going to get out of it. So this is 183. That's pretty high. That means there's a fair amount of nitrogen in this, and it's actually beneficial to the plant. But again, you're not going to use this in container mixes or in potting mixes because it's actually too high. And so those are just some precautions about buying compost bulk wise. So the question becomes, how hot's your pile? This is the research center at the University of Maine that I manage. We do a fair amount of research there. most of our work is done on, temperature and testing. And if you're doing a home compost pile, it's important that you monitor the temperature, because that's one way to know the microbial activity of your pile. And it's not really the temperature that's killing things in the pile. It is the competition between the different biological organisms that are there, the microbes that are there, that are actually doing it. And the temperature is an indication of that biological activity. So the more biological activity you have, the more likely there is competition going on with beneficial and pathogenic organisms, and the more likely that you're killing weed seeds, and the more likely you're killing those pathogens that we have concerns about. And the temperatures that you're really looking for is somewhere around 131 degrees. I also want to give you a little heads up on some issues that come about every now and then. And this is herbicide damage from compost. So there are some herbicides which we call persistent herbicides. And there are 4 broadleaf herbicides that are used in commercial forage production, and actually some in lawn care maintenance, that can actually damage vegetable plants or other crops, and they're called persistent herbicides. And what happens is these materials are often applied to forages. Well, I'll give you the groups first. So they're basically the picloram clopyrrolid, aminoclopyrrolid, and aminocyclopyrrolid. Trade names you can see there on the right. They are a growth hormone. They are an auxin, and you'll get this funky growth going on. And you can see it here at the very tips. They start to curl. They start to become deformed. The leaves start to turn over. So this is a real sign that, or could be a sign that there's some herbicide damage going on. And basically what happens is that herbicide is actually applied to a forage crop, which is then harvested and fed to either grazed or fed to cattle, and it could be cows or horses. That farmer that raised the horses or the cows has manure. They're happy to get rid of it, so they give it to a composter. It goes into the compost, goes through the compost process. You're happy to buy it. It goes into the production system, and believe it or not, that herbicide is tracked all the way through that process. It's not degraded in the digestive system of the cow. It's not degraded in the composting process, and it gets into the compost and goes into the plant and shows up in the plant. And we're talking in parts per billion. Extremely small parts can lead to some pretty major issues. Fortunately, we haven't seen this issue in Maine since 2014 was the last time that I ran into it. Composters are pretty aware of it now. But again, if you're taking things in and doing your own home composting and you want to collect lawn clippings from a lawn maintenance company, or you're doing your own lawn and you're collecting your clippings but have put a weed and feed on it, you can run into problems down the road with the compost being used in your home garden. So I always make sure ask your compost operators. Do you know what the origin of the feedstocks are? Do you know if there's any grass clippings or manures coming from farms that may have fed forages that had these herbicides applied to it, and just be aware of what's going on. And you can actually do what we call a bioassay to see, but like I said, I haven't seen this issue in a number of years, but it's something I always like people to be aware of. So again, the compost math, we're not going to do the compost math. The application rate. The application rate is 6 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet, or 10 to 15 cubic yards per acre. So with that, I'll go back to my original slide here. We didn't talk a lot about process, but time for questions, I guess, is where we're at. Everything you wanted to have answered about compost. Let's see if I can answer it. So